What's going on, guys? Jacob here, and in today's video we are going to talk about progressive overload for hypertrophy, what it is, what it means, how to make sense of all the information out there on progressive overload, and how to actually apply it to your training to make some gains. So I did a video just a few weeks ago on how to set up a program for hypertrophy and structure a microcycle if your goal is to get bigger, so I recommend you check that out. And before we get into things, I want to point you in the direction of two very useful resources. One article by Brian Weiner on Is Load Progression Necessary? And the second is Anecdotes and Observations by Eric Helms on progressive overload. I'm going to link those in the description box below, so make sure you check them out so you can become a more informed lifter. So let's talk about why progressive overload is necessary. When we train, we are going to inadvertently come into a plateau at some point in time. We're going to stall in our training and we're just not going to see any progression in terms of our size, strength, and it can be quite frustrating. And this is simply because one of two things. Number one, you're doing too much. That is, the amount of volume and work you're doing is exceeding your current recovery capacities, and you're simply not able to positively adapt to that training stimulus. In this case, you simply reduce the total amount of work that you're doing and you continue on your way. Secondly, is if you're not doing enough, and this is where progressive overload comes into play. So if you're not doing enough, what has happened is you have accommodated to the current amount of stress that you are imposing on your body during resistance training. And this is really important in understanding what progressive overload is, because it's not just adding weight to the bar, it's increasing the amount of stress that you are exposing to your musculature through the external load and the resistance, tension in your training. And that's all it is. And a really important concept to understand as a means of making sense of progressive overload is the SRA curve. That is stimulate, recover, and adapt. When we go to the gym and we do a set of squats, we are placing a stimulus on the body. Now, this stimulus or stress needs to be disruptive enough to challenge the body's systems, that is, the musculature, the nervous system, your hormones, your immune system. It's got to disrupt a whole host of things, and as a result of that, you are going to see adaptation and you're going to get bigger, better, and stronger. So the next time that stress is imposed on your body, it is no longer going to cause the same amount of disruption, because that is the goal of the body, to maintain homeostasis and ensure that nothing is going to be a threat to your survival, because the human body is an extremely dynamic and adaptive organism, and it will adapt and change to pretty much any stimulus or stress that it's exposed to, whether it's the elements, the heat, the sun, whether it's stresses on your immune system, such as viruses and things like that. The body is going to adapt. So over the course of time, we need to progressively make the stimulus and that stress harder and harder. And this is where a lot of people go wrong. So most people understand the progressive nature of the concept progressive overload, but they miss the overloading part and the disruptive component to progressive overload. A lot of people are going to add in a progression scheme to their training, adding 5 kilos each week to their squats, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be disruptive. Your training must be hard and stressful in order to cause that adaptation, because if it's not, over time, what will happen is you'll recover, and you will only recover to baseline. You're not going to see that positive adaptation that we need to continually make progress. If you continually keep the stimulus the same or the stress the same, you may even detrain. That is, you're not going to even see a return to your initial baseline. So really important to understand that your progression needs to be progressive or sequential in nature. That is, it's logical and makes sense, and it's consistent. And it also needs to be disruptive. That is, overloading and forcing your body to be challenged in a way that's going to see those positive adaptations. Now, the adaptations we are talking about today are hypertrophy. That is, we want to see changes in the myofibrils and the contractile elements, the proteins, so that we're getting bigger and visually looking larger. We need to understand the mechanistic side of things before we start to look at how we apply overload in the gym and with the training variables. So in terms of the mechanisms behind hypertrophy, there seems to be two key factors in terms of what's going to elicit a hypertrophic adaptation. Number one is mechanical tension. That is the force or the resistance of the stimulus in the training, the load on the bar, the cables, the pulleys, all of those things. And the second is metabolic stress, which is simply energy production via anaerobic glycolysis, where we see a buildup of metabolites, lactic acid, hydrogen ion, inorganic phosphate, and these things increases the swelling of the cell, which means that it's going to disrupt the integrity of the cell, which is a stress in and of itself. Now the third, which is not necessarily causative of hypertrophy, but may be an additive component in that it increases growth potential long-term via satellite cell proliferation, myonuclear domain theory, story for another day, is muscle damage. Now, muscle damage is not something we should train for or try to achieve. It's a byproduct of getting that tension and that stress. Now, over the course of time, if we increase and overload the amount of tension placed on the muscles and the amount of stress, metabolic stress, we are going to see an increase in protein balance. That is, muscle protein synthesis will exceed muscle protein breakdown. And if we have sufficient protein intake, we're eating at a calorie surplus or maintenance, thereabouts for the most part, we're going to see that positive protein balance and building muscle over the course of our training career, and that is the goal. When we talk about this in an applied sense, how we apply this to training, we are looking at two very important variables, that is training intensity and training volume. Now, training intensity is going to determine the type of adaptation or training effect, whereas training volume is going to determine the magnitude of that adaptation and ensure there is sufficient amount of training stimulus exposed to the musculature within our session, within our week, and so on and so forth. Training intensity can be broken down into two components. That is intensity load, the weight on the bar, and intensity effort, or relative intensity, which is our proximity to failure. Now, both of these are really important, and when it comes to progressive overload, people typically focus on intensity load, that is adding weight to the bar, and they don't recognize the importance of intensity effort, our proximity to failure, how close we are getting to failure in how we overload our training. Similarly, there seems to be large movement pushing the volume side of things, and this is indeed, supported by the scientific literature in that volume is a key driver in hypertrophy. However, like I mentioned, it's going to determine the magnitude of the adaptation and ensure there is a sufficient training stimulus, but intensity and effort are going to be the primary determinants of muscle growth, not volume. And for long-term progress to occur, like I mentioned, we need to have a progressively harder training stimulus in the form of tension or metabolic stress with sufficient volumes. Now, people have gotten a lot bigger and a lot stronger over the course of time with less than 10 sets per week or without adding any sets week to week or month to month, year to year. So we can look anecdotally as well and see that it is tension and effort that is also a huge component of muscle growth, and we can't overlook these factors. So now when it comes to progressing your training, we're going to be looking at three key variables for the most part. That is reps, sets, and load. If we are adding load to the bar week to week, we are increasing the amount of tension and potentially reducing the duration at which we're exposing the muscles to that tension. And this is not necessarily a bad thing, because we know that high tension stimulus can lead to maximal motor unit recruitment even when we're not getting close to failure. But it is a way to build muscle in a form of progressive overload that's very useful. But your ability to add weight to the bar will slow down over time, and sometimes more weight on the bar isn't necessarily indicative of bigger muscles. It can be a function of improved neural qualities. That is, your rate coding and your central nervous system becoming more efficient at lifting the weights, and it's not necessarily the muscles getting bigger and allowing you to move more weight. So this is really important to understand in terms of how we progressively overload our training, because if we have a ingrained motor pattern that is a learned skill and our exercise selection is pretty consistent and we are moving more weight over time, well, we can almost guarantee that we're getting bigger and there's more muscle being developed that's moving that weight. However, if we're constantly changing our exercises, or we're new to a lift, or we still haven't learned the motor pattern proficiently yet, any strength improvements in load may be a result of the central nervous system becoming more efficient at lifting the weight and not necessarily bigger muscles. And when it comes to your training level of advancement, As a beginner, you are going to see very, very linear and fast progression in terms of the loads that you can lift, as you will in the early stages of being an intermediate, but then it will slow down and load progressions may no longer be feasible in terms of building muscle, and you need to look to other means such as reps and sets. Now, when we add reps to a set and we keep the load the same, for example, we do 3x8 at 100 kilos on the squat, and the next week we do 3x9, we are not necessarily increasing the magnitude of tension, but instead we are increasing the duration of tension placed on the muscle, which is very important because now we're going to be moving a little bit closer towards failure and eliciting an effective training stimulus and a very, very viable means of progressive overload. So not only do we need to be paying attention to the load on the bar, we also need to be considering our proximity to failure, and training with proximities of 1 to 3 reps before failure is, especially if you're training with lighter loads. So lighter loads are not necessarily going to have the same amount of tension and recruit all the motor units immediately like heavier loads will, but they will need to be trained closer to failure in order to maximally recruit all the motor units and those high threshold fibers. And this is otherwise known as Henneman-Sayers principle, something for you guys to check out. But adding reps and getting closer and closer to failure over the course of a mesocycle can be a very useful means of progressively overloading your training if your goal is hypertrophy, because you are increasing tension, the time of under tension, and you're also training those high threshold motor units if you're getting close to failure. And if you're using lighter loads, then this is really important. So it's not always about adding weight to the bar, guys. There's many, many ways to skin the proverbial cat. When it comes to sets, we are increasing the total amount of work performed. We're not necessarily going to be getting closer and closer to failure, although multiple sets will cause more fatigue, meaning you will be closer to failure in those final sets just as a function of accumulating fatigue in the prior sets. However, we're going to be increasing our work capacity and the total amount of work done, which may not necessarily be causative of hypertrophy, but it will ensure that there is sufficient exposure to that tension stimulus, which can be really useful. So adding sets as an intermediate and increasing your work capacity can be a great way to build your base, so to speak, so that you can allow further adaptations to occur long term. But it's important to recognize that with more total work comes more fatigue, and this may mask fitness and your performance, meaning that you may see your repetition strength drop off. I mentioned in my previous video, the best proxy for muscle growth when it comes to measuring our training performance is repetition strength across multiple sets. So now that we understand these 3 variables and what they mean, how they affect our adaptations and the type of training stimulus or stress that we're imposing on the body by increasing reps, load, or sets, we need to then make sure that over the course of our training career, we are improving our repetition strength across a number of sets and across all of our exercises, not just our squat, our bench, our deadlift, but also our accessory movements, our isolation exercises, because this is what is going to lead to bigger muscles. If you're getting stronger on the squat, but then all of a sudden you can't perform a single set of leg extensions because you went all out on the squat, well, that's going to be problematic. So it's about monitoring not just a single movement, but all of your exercises and aiming to progressively increase them over time. So now we need some strategies to apply this overload. So we have a single progression, and what this may look like in a program is simply manipulating one variable, either reps, sets, or load. And most people are very familiar with this. That is, they'll have 3x5 on the squat for 5 weeks and they'll just add weight week to week to week. The second means of applying overload is one of my favorites for hypertrophy because it takes into account both progression in load and repetitions, which allows us to not only get a greater magnitude of tension by adding weight, but it also forces us to increase the duration of that tension by adding repetitions. And this is called a double progression, where we manipulate 2 variables over the course of a mesocycle. Now, what this might look like is 3 sets of a rep range within 6 to 8. Now, you might start with 3x8 at 100 kilos on the squat. The next week you will increase load at 105 kilos and you'll start at the bottom end of the rep range, hitting 3x6. You will then work up in the reps until you hit 3x8 at 105 kilos, add weight, rinse and repeat. Now this is one of my favorite means of progressive overload, especially on compound lifts, and it works really well for most exercises because, like I mentioned, we're not just taking care of that intensity load, but also intensity effort as well, getting both magnitude of tension increasing over the course of a mesocycle, as well as increasing the duration of that tension, which is very, very important for building muscle. The third means of overload is, you guessed it, a triple progression. This means manipulating 3 variables, and we're gonna simply manipulate your reps, your sets, and your load over the course of a mesocycle. So you will first add reps, then add sets, then add weight. And this is a great way to overload your training, especially for those smaller muscle groups where the next increment in load just may be too great for that small muscle group to handle, such as a side raise or a bicep curl, where you have to go up a dumbbell by 2 kilos, 2.5 kilos. You simply can't do that week to week. So a slower, more conservative progression model like this can be very, very useful. And finally, if you want to get big, you need to be tracking your progress. So you need to be logging your workouts, being consistent with your training, your exercise selection. It's not program hopping or doing anything silly like that. Your nutrition, your sleep, your recovery. You need to be measuring and managing all the variables that are going to influence your ability to train hard, recover, and adapt, because at the end of the day, that's what hypertrophy is all about. Also, taking progress pictures every month and assessing over the course of time, and making sure that you're taking scale weigh-ins and that your rate of progress is in line with your level of advancement. So obviously we're gonna see much faster rate of gain on the scales as a beginner than we are advanced. So keeping an eye on this is really important. Another useful means of tracking your progress is girth measurements, and DEXA scans are highly unreliable, so I wouldn't even waste your money on those. So guys, that's progressive overload. I hope it was useful. I hope you learned a thing or two. If you have any questions, comment below, make sure you like the video, and I'll speak to you all next time.